Well, welcome for one final time. We have finished our reading of the book of Revelation, seeking understanding, the message and the meaning, believing that we too can receive a blessing. I share in this final video a summary, not a detailed study. The detail is in the lessons. This summary simply overviews the book as a whole, tries to show again how the book fits together. I realize that there are lots of theories. I've tried to construct a meaningful explanation, meaningful interpretation that is based on the historical context, the situation of the recipients, the apocalyptic nature of the book. I believe that what you will find in this series of video studies is not exactly duplicated in any other resources that you might consult. In chapters 1 through 3, John in the Spirit writes down letters dictated to him. John will witness or give testimony about the witness of Jesus, who is the faithful witness. John is writing about what is and what will be. The book begins with a vision, John in the Spirit on Patmos, the island, one like a son of man, dictating letters to 7 churches, encouraging them to faithfulness, to overcome and receive God's promise. In chapters 4 through 16, which is the majority of the book, the central primary vision of the book is revealed in 2 scrolls. I call this the apocalyptic vision of the book. First, in chapters 4 through 11, John in the Spirit is transported to the heavenly throne room where he sees the Lamb open 7 scrolls, 7 seals rather, of a scroll. The 7th seal reveals 7 trumpets, and just before the 7th trumpet, John receives a little open scroll, which he must also prophesy. This little open scroll finishes up the central apocalyptic vision of the book. These 2 scrolls tell us how that God is at work in the world and how that God's wrath will ultimately be poured out on Rome. The scroll opened by the Lamb clearly shows God in control, even when the church is suffering martyrdom. God knows and protects his own, even in the face of death. God is judging evil. Partial judgments are God's way of seeking repentance. But without repentance of those who are doing evil, God will act. The kingdom of the Christ is certain, and heaven's fury will be unleashed. That's the end of chapter 11. So in chapters 12 through 16, the little scroll reveals Satan's efforts to destroy the salvation work of the Christ child, the defeat of Satan in heaven, only intensifying his efforts on earth, where he is also thwarted. He recruits allies in the beast, the false prophet, the Roman Empire. Almost immediately, the forces of the Lamb are revealed as more than sufficient for the battle. Angelic announcements speak of the fall of Rome and of all who would be loyal to Rome. It is, however, still a time for patience and endurance on the part of the saints. The climax of the little scroll comes as 7 bowls of God's wrath are poured out on Rome. No more delay. It is done. The Armageddon story is told in 5 short verses, which brings us to the 3rd vision of the book. John in the Spirit, carried to the wilderness by one of the angels who poured out the plagues, and John will learn more about the details of the judgment on Rome. Rome is clearly identified, chapter 17. Laments are heard. The fall of Rome is pictured in a parable, chapter 18. Heaven is rejoicing because the bride is prepared and victorious in chapter 19. And then in the last part of chapter 19, the battle of Armageddon is detailed more than we had in chapter 16, the battle in which Christ conquers the beast and the false prophet and all of the armies who have assembled as allies. Despite numerous writings and theories about chapter 20, really this summary is short. The conquest declares the victory of the martyrs in the kingdom, resurrected and validated. The conquest is certain because Satan is no longer able to deceive the nations. The church has a time of peace and blessing, and is safe again, but that doesn't mean Satan won't try again. But when he does, his defeat is certain. In fact, the defeat of all opponents is certain, and the victory and blessing of the faithful is also certain. And then in the last vision of the book, John in the Spirit sees the details of that victory and blessing, carried away to a high mountain, seeing the coming of the New Jerusalem, and finally an epilogue closes the book, very much like the introductory prologue, reminding us again that these are things that must soon come to pass. So did the things that John writes about happen soon? Don't seal the book. These are events that must occur soon. Well, compared with parallel passages in the Old Testament, that likely means that these things would happen within the next couple hundred years. Did Jesus fulfill the promise of the letters to be present and bless and strengthen those who would overcome the difficulties of the first century? Did God continue to control the world and his judgments reach a climax of patience so that Rome was judged, became impotent as an opponent of the church? Was Satan's influence diminished as God promised? The third vision describes Rome's fall and speaks of a coming time of peace and blessing and the ultimate demise of all of God's opponents. And the fourth vision further expands that description of peace and blessing on God's faithful in the first century, but also, of course, the ultimate blessing of all of God's faithful in every generation is certain. As we read and apply the book, we rest secure in the same promises. We see that the ultimate blessing on God's faithful reaches across all the centuries. And for the original recipients who were just trying to get through life and maintain allegiance to Jesus, this apocalyptic message was one of comfort and encouragement, building spiritual stamina, perseverance, endurance in the face of their circumstances, faithful to death. And that promise and that blessing to us, all of God's faithful, reaching forward across the centuries. Yes, God did act, and he did act quickly. Rome's power began to wane even as the persecution continued. And a little over 200 years later, peace was reality between church and state. Will Satan exercise some kind of world-dominating power in the future? Well, he'll try. That's his goal. But his ultimate destiny is already determined, along with all of those who will stand against God. And the ultimate destiny of the faithful is also secure. Again, as we conclude this summary, my prayer for you is that we might read, that we might understand, and that we might receive God's blessing. Thank you again for sharing this series with me. God bless.